In this video, guys, we're going to be talking about the Manchester United takeover saga with Sheikh Jassim and Sir Jim Ratcliffe. And after looking at that in detail, we're going to be seeing whether or not Sheikh Jassim, if he can't buy Manchester United, may turn his attention to Tottenham Hotspur. And what does that look like? Is that a story that you would like to see play out? Yes, guys, how you doing? Welcome back to the Spurs Talk Show. I am Sean Butler. I hope you're all happy and healthy doing the things you love. This is going to be probably quite a long video to try and get through all the detail I want, so I'm going to get straight into it. Only if you enjoy the content, make sure you hit the like button, hit the subscribe if you haven't already, join the 19,000 fans of football that have gone before, and hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Guys, the Sheikh Jassim takeover of Manchester United is off. The news broke over the weekend. I've been waiting for a couple of days to kind of figure out how I want to talk about this. In today's video, I'm going to be kind of merging two stories here. First of all, to talk about what happened with the Manchester United takeover. It has ended up going in the direction of Sir Jim Ratcliffe. At least that's on paper. The story hasn't been ratified yet by the Manchester United board. That should happen on Thursday. And if it does, then Sir Jim Ratcliffe has essentially bought 25% of Manchester United for a price of £1.35 billion or $1.65 billion. That values Manchester United at that particular valuation metric at $6.6 billion. Now, it's really important that in order to understand the rationale for why it's so expensive and how much of a ginormous increase in valuation that is relative to today's share price, and in fact, more crazily, the share price that Manchester United was being traded for back in November the 16th of last year, when the news first broke that the Glazer family were open to an investment or a full takeover. We need to understand what is coming on the horizon for Premier League clubs and the potential for them to get more juice from the squeeze out of the Premier League broadcasting rights. If you understand that, you might understand why it is that Sir Jim Ratcliffe has paid such a premium. And what is even more crazy is that Sheikh Jassim was allegedly, according to reports, willing to pay a higher valuation, a bigger number for the entirety of Manchester United, but the Glazers turned them down in favor of accepting a lower valuation, still a crazy high valuation, but a lower valuation to Sheikh Jassim in order to only sell 25% and to keep 75% or there or thereabouts of the ownership of Manchester United for at least the next 3 years. From there, we're going to then move into whether or not this is the end of the Sheikh Jassim in the Premier League story, whether or not they're going to continue to try and find a football club. And if it's Tottenham, then what does that look like? And to me, I think it's really important to kind of remind everybody around what is the value proposition to Tottenham Hotspur fans of potentially getting into bed with a new buyer, a new owner of the club. And does the value proposition look the same to Tottenham Hotspur as it does to Manchester United? I'm not sure it does. It doesn't mean that it's not a good idea to take some investment if possible, but I think we need to understand what's going on. So let's start with taking a quick look at the share price of Manchester United. For those of you who don't know, Manchester United is, of course, listed on the New York Stock Exchange. You, if you wanted to, can go and buy some shares in Manchester United, and if you had them already, you can sell them. There's 163 million shares in issue in Manchester United, and you can find out what the stock market believes the true valuation of Manchester United is by timesing the amount of shares in issue, 163 million, by the price per share, the cost per share, which today currently is $18 per share. So if you do that very simple calculation, 163 million times by 18, you'll land on a number that the market believes that currently Manchester United is worth $3 billion. And so when you find out, when you remember that Sir Jim Ratcliffe has paid $1.65 billion for 25%, then in a nutshell, Sir Jim Ratcliffe is willing to pay much more than double the current valuation, according to today's share price, of Manchester United. But what's even crazier is that you have to remember that today's share price, just like Friday's share price and every single day after November the 17th last year, has baked into the share price the potential, the possibility, and the probability that someone is coming in to buy Manchester United, whether it's Sir Jim Ratcliffe or whether it was going to be Sheikh Jassim and his consortium from Qatar. And so that share price was artificially inflated because everyone thought that there was someone going to be buying the club and therefore they wanted to benefit from the share price rise. In order to find the true valuation of Manchester United, you have to go back and look at the share price on November the 16th of 2022, before the Glaziers announced that they were willing to sell either the entirety or part of the football club. And on that particular day, the share price traded at $13 per share, which gives you a market capitalization, a true value back then, according to the stock market, of $2.1 billion, which is only $500 million more than what Sir Jim Ratcliffe has just paid for only 25%. So you have to ask yourselves why. Why is it that Sir Jim Ratcliffe has just paid for 25% what a year ago was worth 80% of the entire valuation of Manchester United? And in the last year, the stadium has got 1 year older, 1 year more disrepair. Manchester United have, regressed on the football field, seemingly, at least relative to other competition. Tottenham Hotspur looking stronger, Liverpool are looking stronger again. Arsenal certainly are looking better than Manchester United. Newcastle continue to improve. Even Chelsea are starting to get out of their sluggish start to the season. And so it's never been harder for Manchester United to qualify in the Champions League spots, which is where you can get that revenue back and try to chip away at the very expensive investment that you've made. So what is the reason? If Manchester United are finding it more difficult to compete, and yet Sir Jim Ratcliffe is willing to put all that money in, and Sheikh Jassim is willing to put in more, there has to be something else. It got me to thinking back to about April of this year, when Simon Jordan put an article out on the Daily Mail that talked about the ability for the Premier League to walk away from Sky Sports and BT Sports, TNT, whatever they're currently called, to set up their own Netflix for live sport. And that situation might just materialize at the next opportunity when the Premier League renegotiates their broadcasting rights for the 25-26 season. In the article, Simon Jordan writes, if the Premier League launched their own platform, they could have 100 million subscribers easily. If they then charged £10 a month for an all-you-can-eat football buffet, they would be generating £1 billion a month and £36 billion over the 3-year cycle, as opposed to the current £9 billion, and that is even before you factor in advertising revenues. So Simon Jordan believes that in the next couple of years, if the Premier League wanted to, they could walk away and very easily set up their own version of Sportflix, whatever you want to call it, the Premier League Flix, live sport, and would immediately be able to generate 4 times as much revenue than they currently get paid from Sky and BT and all of their other kind of global broadcasting deals. On top of that, the advertising revenue that can come, that is the elephant in the room that I don't think has been baked into the valuations of many companies, at least those that are in the stock market, although it might explain why some of these chairmen believe that there's no need to sell yourself short in the valuation of your football club. So it's quite difficult to figure out exactly what goes through the minds of chairmen when trying to evaluate how much their brand is worth. But when you know what could easily happen over the next couple of years in the largest slice of your revenue stream generation. So Tottenham Hotspur, for example, make 33% of their entire revenue from TV and media money. It is the second largest slice of Tottenham's revenue stream behind commercial deals and use of the stadium for events and those sorts of things. And so if you think about the fact that you could potentially be getting 4 to 5 to 6 times that much money coming in just from the Premier League renegotiating the TV rights deals, then you can understand why the total revenue for Tottenham Hotspur could double without anything else meaningfully changing. And therefore, the value of your business should also. The same could be said for Manchester United and others. And that might explain why Sir Jim Ratcliffe is willing to pay over twice what the current valuation of Manchester United is. And it might also explain why Sheikh Jassim is also interested. Unfortunately for Sheikh Jassim, and unfortunately for the Manchester United fans that were far more interested in seeing him come in and write off the debt with the club and invest $1.5 billion in the infrastructure of the stadium and the surrounding area, that hasn't materialized. And if the deal is ratified on Thursday, then Manchester United are going to go in a new direction. That isn't necessarily a terrible direction, but it might not be the immediate panacea for all of Manchester United's ails. What's next for Sheikh Jassim, his family, and the consortium that it represents? well, they have to decide whether it's time to walk away from the Premier League altogether and look for pastures new, or if they have in fact decided they absolutely want to get a footprint into the Premier League, then they have to turn their attentions elsewhere. And one of those teams that have been mentioned over the last 6 months as a potential outlet is, of course, Tottenham Hotspur. We have spoken about this many times. And for the rest of this video, we're going to look at what is the consequences of a Tottenham takeover bid from Sheikh Jassim, whether or not Daniel Levy would accept it, what sort of price. And of course, on top of that, is the value proposition for Tottenham as strong to have money coming in from the Middle East as it would be for Manchester United? But back in January of 2023, the rumors first started emerging about a potential Qatari investment into Tottenham Hotspur. At the time, it wasn't Sheikh Jassim and his family consortium. It was Qatar Sports Investment, also known as QSI, the company that currently owns 100% of Paris Saint-Germain, alongside some minority investments in other clubs around European football. If QSI were interested in buying Tottenham Hotspur, because they own 100% of Paris Saint-Germain, they would only be able to buy 25% stake, a maximum minority stake in Tottenham Hotspur. Those stories were dashed initially when Daniel Levy spoke at the Cambridge Debate Union and said he hasn't had any conversations with any investment vehicle whatsoever from anywhere. And because Tottenham are a publicly listed company, he would have a duty of care to the other shareholders that own about 13.5% of Tottenham Hotspur to bring any potential investment to the table. That officially is still the case right now. But over the last 3 or 4 months, going back to about April or May, the noise back then about Sheikh Jassim starting to get frustrated with the Glazers' lack of willingness to strike a deal did create some noise in the media that Tottenham Hotspur may just be a second option for Sheikh Jassim in a world where he fails with Manchester United. Those stories today are, of course, re-emerging with the noise that Sheikh Jassim has failed to buy Manchester United. And I want to point you back to a quote that we have from Daniel Levy when he spoke to Bloomberg News just a couple of weeks ago. And he said, and I quote, "I've got no real interest to leave Tottenham, but I have a duty to consider anything that anyone may want to propose," Levy told Bloomberg. "It's not about me. It's about what's right for the club. We have 30,000 shareholders who own approximately 13.5%. We run this club as if it is a public company." So on that note, guys, it's time to figure out whether or not, now that Sheikh Jassim has in fact lost out to Sir Jim Ratcliffe, is there any chance at all that Sheikh Jassim may turn his attention to Tottenham Hotspur? And if so, then what does that look like? And is the value proposition of Qatar wealth coming into Tottenham quite as strong as it is with Manchester United? Let's find out. So the main difference between the value proposition of new money coming in from Sheikh Jassim into Manchester United versus Tottenham Hotspur starts and finishes really with what the infrastructure spend could do. And on top of that, the complications around the effective interest rate on the debt that Manchester United have relative to Tottenham Hotspur. I don't want to bore you with this information, but in a nutshell, as of March 2023, Manchester United have just shy of $900 million worth of debt onto the club. The effective interest rate that Manchester United pay on that debt currently is about 6%, according to GuruFocus.com, which equates to about $54 million per year of interest that has to be paid on the debt that has not been paid down anywhere near quickly enough for the Manchester United faithful. Tottenham Hotspur, conversely, have long-term secured debt of 2.81% per year on their financial borrowings of about £852.6 million. So we owe more in debt than Manchester United, but we pay significantly lower, to the tune of about 30% less in interest payments every single year. Now, Sheikh Jassim, in his bid for Manchester United, was going to wipe that debt. He was also going to spend $1.5 billion on rebuilding the stadium, rebuilding the training ground that has been compared to Reading FC currently at Manchester United. And of course, on top of that, rebuild some of the areas around the stadium, alongside putting some money into the club's capital for immediate share transfers. And in so doing, by writing off the debt, you then free up the $56 million circa that is spent on interest rates every single year for other purposes. There is an opportunity cost to having that debt hanging over your head. One of the plans that Sheikh Jassim was putting forward was to rebuild, redesign the stadium in its entirety and take it to nearly 100,000 seater stadium. You would envision that they would be looking like all Premier League clubs are right now at the efforts that Daniel Levy has made to turn the stadium into a place that before now that has really just been occupied once every 2 weeks or twice every 2 weeks for football matches, into a stadium that can generate revenues, get onto that top and bottom line of Tottenham Hotspur's balance sheet and profit and loss accounts every single day of the year. Manchester United would surely do the same thing. And when you consider that from an FFP perspective, infrastructure spend does not affect your FFP whatsoever, Manchester United under Sheikh Jassim could have written off their debt, rebuilt the stadium to its entirety, and then allowed that stadium to generate revenue streams similar to what Tottenham Hotspur are currently doing with their own. And as I said before, Tottenham Hotspur's commercial activities are responsible for the most amount of revenues as a single line item in the profit and loss accounts. When Manchester United have already got £660 million worth of revenue every single year, which is about 30 to 40% higher than Tottenham Hotspur's, and yet don't use the stadium for the same reasons or the same purposes that Tottenham Hotspur do, you can think forward 3 or 4 or 5 years and envision a scenario where Manchester United have less commitments in expenses on their balance sheet to the tune of that debt that doesn't need to be serviced anymore. But on top of that, far more revenue streams coming in from the Manchester United stadium. If Sheikh Jassim did come into Tottenham Hotspur, then if they were to keep to the same sort of motif and pay off the debt within the club, even though it's on long-term cheap secure debt, you're only going to see the benefit of £25 million a year, circa £25 million a year in interest payments that are no longer necessary, that then can be used elsewhere, relative to the $56 million that would be saved and could be spent elsewhere with Manchester United. There would be absolutely no need for any infrastructure spend. And so that benefit that would behoove Manchester United isn't applicable to Tottenham Hotspur. And so there's no more additional juice from the squeeze that can be found with regards to the infrastructure argument. Where else do you find the benefits of having new money coming into the club? Bearing in mind that Tottenham Hotspur, even with new investment, can't just break FFP rules and continue to spend money that the balance sheet doesn't represent. The new rules around FFP that by the 25-26 season will be in its full maturity state that any club can only spend the aggregate of 70% of the club's revenues. So if Tottenham Hotspur, under an investment from Sheikh Jassim, can't really benefit to the same tune as Manchester United can from debt write-offs, and can't benefit at all from the idea of getting more revenue streams out of the stadium that Manchester United could absolutely benefit from Sheikh Jassim, then where does the incentive come from for Daniel Levy, for Tottenham Hotspur, to either sell the club in its entirety or to take a significant investment from someone like Sheikh Jassim? Well, can Sheikh Jassim just come in and spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds on immediate players like Chelsea have done? Well, not really. Todd Boehly took advantage of loopholes that were in existence at Chelsea last season that have since been closed, with regards buying players and letting them amortize over 8-year contract cycles. That was seen as a misstep by the Premier League, by the people that implemented the FFP rules, and has since been closed out. Now, you can still sign players for longer than 6-year contracts, but in terms of amortizing that player from an FFP perspective, 6 years is your limit. Todd Boehly also benefited from the ability to sell some of the club's top assets that were deemed surplus to requirements, to be able to allow for this extraordinary net spend of £1 billion+ over the last 18 months at Chelsea, by selling players, key players, for good money, like Kai Havertz and Mason Mount, just to name a couple. Tottenham Hotspur don't really have the same access to undesirable assets that carry value within our player squad roster. We've spent the last 2 years trying our best to offlay Tanguy Ndombele's and the Eric Dyers and the Giovanni Lo Celso's to no avail. In fact, we have 5 players this season that run out of contract and will probably be leaving on free transfers. So any investment from Sheikh Jassim would have to factor in that the inability to raise revenues from player sales at the peak would limit the amount of money that we could spend, even if there was a desire to do so from an FFP perspective. Again, when you compare that to Manchester United, the same value proposition doesn't exist. The major value proposition from my perspective in terms of how Tottenham could benefit from huge investment from Sheikh Jassim if he was to turn his attention to Tottenham Hotspur would be from 2 major factors. One could be the inevitable setting up of a multi-club ownership model similar to the City Group, something that I've been speaking about on this channel for quite a while. I believe that Scott Munn's eventual job will be to educate the people at Tottenham on how to do that effectively, given how much experience he has with City Football Group in Asia. And that could be a way that Tottenham Hotspur can find efficiencies and economies of scale by investing under Sheikh Jassim into teams across the world, across Europe, in minority stakes, but to be able to utilize their youth academies alongside having the economies of scale that comes from sharing your back office operations from a cost exercise point of view. To me, multi-club ownership is a way that these sovereign wealth funds can come into a football club and add efficiencies that somehow still skirt around the rules of FFP so that you can acquire new talent elsewhere and eventually find a way to make them come to your premium club, the club at the top end of the scale when necessary. The last area that I think that Tottenham Hotspur could really benefit from Sheikh Jassim or someone like him coming in would be with regard player transfer acquisitions that sit under the age of 18 and count as youth team prospect. We've seen teams like Chelsea over the last 18 months and teams like Manchester City for years acquiring all of the strong youth talent that exists around the world as best as possible, loaning them back to the clubs in which they were bought or putting them out into the City Football Group where possible as well, in order to learn their trade before you loan them out to better clubs and eventually bring them in. That is a way that you can circumvent the rules of FFP. You can acquire these talents if you have the money. None of the money that goes to acquire youth team players sits against your FFP. Once they reach 18 years old, then the salaries attached to those players will affect your number and how close you get to the 70% or 80% of revenue. But the actual acquisition of them, as long as they are youth team players, does not affect. And that is something that Tottenham currently are taking very seriously, this youth-centric approach to player acquisition, with the hope that as high a percentage as possible of these youth team players that have incredibly high ceilings can be loaned out. And if they're not a good fit for Tottenham Hotspur's first team, then they'll be a good fit for someone else's. And that is a way that has been used to great effect by teams like Chelsea recently, again, to raise revenues. By selling some of these players 2 years later, you can put the money that you receive for the player sales against your FFP number to allow you to spend more money necessary on players for your first team, sign them on longer term contracts, and then amortize them appropriately. So for me, the idea of Sheikh Jassim coming into Tottenham would be very desirable to most, but I don't think it has as strong and as compelling a value proposition as a takeover of that size and that magnitude does to Manchester United. It's still something that isn't necessarily to be written off, but there are consequences to going down that path. As a fan of football personally, my personal take on this is that I think that Daniel Levy has done very well, allowing Tottenham to compete relatively well over the last 20 years since the influx of money that has come in from those sorts of nations. And I personally am proud of the fact that Tottenham can compete organically and that our success can never be pointed at as a result of sugar daddy ownership that can be described as purchasing your success. There's only a few other clubs at the top end of the Premier League spectrum that can voice that same pride. Brighton, Liverpool, Arsenal, Brentford, Aston Villa. Those are the sorts of teams that haven't gone down that path yet, whereas Manchester City, Newcastle and Chelsea obviously can't. And if we were to go down that path, then the last consequence I'll say is that you forevermore can't ever point fingers and say you only won because of this. You're then part of that process. If that's okay with you, then fine. But just remember that the benefits of new ownership for Tottenham Hotspur are not as clear cut and not as palpable as they are the clubs that have the infrastructure that they can still dig into or are currently facing massive amounts of unsecured, unstructured debt, that the interest rates of which create a very powerful opportunity cost, because the money that they could be spending elsewhere, if it wasn't for interest rates, would give them another reason to be competitive. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Are you okay with Sheikh Jassim coming to Tottenham Hotspur? Are you okay with oil money being a part of our story? Or would you prefer Tottenham Hotspur to continue on the organic growth and the organic trajectory that we're currently on, even if it means the chances of success are more limited? Like, subscribe, and comment. And as always, bye-bye.